Okay, thanks, Phil. Um, I'm Brian McMahon, and it's so nice to be here. I just want to give a quick hello and thanks to Kathy Shepard Jones for um, approving my participation in this presentation. And I also want to say hello to a department chair there at Kentucky, Ralph Crystal. He shares the same barber as Phil and I. And I were classmates back in the mid 70s at the University of Wisconsin, and he's a very important friend, and a great rehab scholar. And so hello to Ralph. The first important finding we found, and just to show you how these data are used and what's surprising things we've learned about ADA, how it's playing out, and what impact it's had in terms of things like impact studies, was the run-up, concerns the run-up to the ADA amendments. And the ADA amendments were very interesting. Um, they were arguing in late 2008, literally business representatives and disability advocates were almost locked up in a boardroom, debating and arguing what would stay in the amendments and what would go. It's nice to know, for me, the advocates really won the field and won the day, and that they had a little help from some of our research, because the business, of course, was making the same argument it was making back in 88 to 90 before the original ADA, that there would be this tsunami of ADA litigation yet to develop. They use the word tsunami because in around 2008, you might recall there was a big tsunami in Japan, and it was in the news every day. And oh, the sky is falling and the world is going to come to an end if we enhance or restore the Congress's intent when they passed the original ADA. The fact of the matter is that if you run an employment organization that's in the top 2% in size, over 1,000 workers, the odds that you would receive a single complaint in any given year from a charging party under ADA Title I is about 1 in 4,800, almost 1 in 5,000. So the tsunami has never arrived. It didn't arrive after 1990. It didn't arrive after the amendments. And it's just so much hysteria, which we've become quite accustomed to, even in 2020 and 21. ADA issues, including, they were also really under assault. They wanted the alternative prongs of the definition of disability thrown out. For those of you who are not, as ADA literate, I'm told the audience is very ADA literate. The ADA has this traditional standard, what you would expect definition of disability, that requires you to be disabled pretty much in current time, and that your disability be somewhat significant and substantially limit a major life activity. But of course, in the original ADA, they threw in some wrinkles. You could also be protected if you were not disabled at all, but an employer mistakenly regards you as disabled. You could also, that's prong 2. Prong 3 is you could be disabled if you're not disabled today, but you have a history or record of disability. And the third one was particularly aggravating to employers in 1990. You don't have to have a record of disability. You don't have to be mistakenly disabled. You could simply be a friend or a colleague or a supporter of a disability claim by another person. But if you're an associate, a known associate, isn't that mystery? So it sounds criminal. A known associate of a person with a disability, you too could receive ADA Title I protections. And the employers, of course, in 2008 said these things are ridiculous. They must go. They have to be thrown out. And that's the end of that story. And by the way, they said there's no way. Of course, the amendments came about because of the Sutton trilogy of Supreme Court decisions, basically brought to us by Sandra Day O'Connor, 3 decisions from 97 to 99, 98 to 2000 maybe, 3 Supreme Court decisions that really weakened the ADA. And the employer said, no, that's not true, that's not happened. allegations are still at record level. Well, we managed through the good graces of Dr. Imparato and the American Associations with Persons with Disabilities to bring forward a couple slides like this. The slide on the left shows here's the Sutton trilogy going on in 98, 99, 2000, 2001. Once the Supreme Court impacts kick in, look at the plummet in allegation activity from a high of a very steady stream of 30, mid-30s, 35, 36, 37,000 per year to a low, can you imagine, of 9,000 people. And where are we out here with this 11,000, 9,000 figure? Well, you can see we're working on the Amendments Act. So we put this in front of the employers, excuse me, that's my mistake. We put this data in front of the employers, and there's no denying that the Sutton trilogy has destroyed the spirit and intent of the ADA, and it must be restored to original congressional intent. The amendments passed, and look at the huge rise just even up until 2011. We have much later data than this, where complaints are now reaching there's much more protections given, much more secure protections. The amendments were passed overwhelmingly, a voice vote in the House of Representatives, and a 97-1 vote with 2 abstentions or something like that in the Senate. Probably the most bipartisan legislation ever in most of our lifetimes, certainly my lifetime. And the point being here that if Congress is a do-nothing thing, Congress probably never had such a bipartisan bill that meant so much to so many. And it really shows that the ADA now is here to stay. And on the right, what you have is basically the first prong of the definition of disability compared to the 2, 3, and 4, the alternative prongs that they wanted to throw out. We showed that not only did all you have to get from this is the basic trend line. Not only were there as many allegations proportionately using the alternative prongs, which shows that the prongs had legs, there was reason that all these second, third, and fourth prongs were necessary, but that people who were invoking the prongs for protection, as opposed to the original definition of disability, actually had a higher merit rates. That's, the most best example is shown in the red line for prong 3, actually had higher merit rates. In other words, more actual discrimination than perceived or possibly unnecessary allegations than even the original stem of the ADA, the original understanding. Well, I don't want to say that the employers folded their tent at this point, but a lot of serious issues were taken off the table. And this is among the reasons that research can make a difference. Facts are stubborn things, but you've got to have the data to prove it. And our data was used in that particular case to a truly high impact finding. Here's another one for all of you to keep in mind. That is the biggest lesson. This is just written in stone at this point. Remember, there are 24 possible EEOC issues. And I used to go out and do training, and training programs in 1990s would be half a day, a day and a half, 2-day workshops, exploring with them all possible 24 issues. Little did I know that if you bundle the issues and you were just to focus the fire hose on this massive forest fire, or focus your research as a virus on these particular viruses, you could reduce workplace discrimination by 84%. In other words, firing is the #1 issue of workplace discrimination at 34%, reasonable accommodation, 9%, 19% of the whole database, terms and conditions of employment and harassment and intimidation are quite active at 10%, and hiring is quite active at 11%. But I don't have to tell you that before the ADA, we approached workplace discrimination as if it were all about hiring. You can remember all the hire the handicapped stuff that goes back to the 20s and 30s. The fact of the matter is that you get much more bang for your anti-discrimination investment if you tend to who's getting fired and reasonable accommodation first. But by focusing on all 5 of these, you can do your training now in 1, 2, 3 hours, a half a day, and be very successful. This is also probably a big shock and disappointment to our disability advocates in the audience. Merit raises are very rare. They always run at about 24%. In other words, if you file a complaint with the EEOC, the chances that the EEOC is going to uphold your complaint at the end of a 6-month to a year process is about 1 in 4. 3 times out of 4, the employer is going to prevail. And if you think that that is a problem, you just have to understand the employers are well defended. They're getting more and more ADA literate. You might think they're not ADA literate, but they're a lot more ADA literate than some groups of advocates even. They prevail quite often. And we'll show you more specifics on that. But one thing I really want to point out that's very important in understanding this is that these ratios are almost identical to everything you'll find in the Civil Rights Act. So it's 25% for women and harassment issues, discrimination because of gender, discrimination because of race, national origin, age, pay equity, gay and lesbian, GLBTQ issues, race. This is somehow baked in to employment discrimination. And I think it helps that people understand it. You have to be persistent to get merit, and you have to have a case and really understand the ADA. And that's why being able to predict merit and so on can often tell an employer or a charging party whether or not it behooves them to proceed. Of course, it's always their individual decision. Here's an interesting finding. Can we predict outcomes? Phil was right. Yes, we can. For example, you find weird things like there's very high merit in hiring discrimination. They win quite often if they're males with physical or sensory impairments. There's very low merit rates. They win very rarely, except they do good in matters of termination. For drug and alcohol impairments, there's very low activity in ADA because for drug and alcohol anything, you rarely see a case filed, mostly because those matters are now handled by the Drug-Free Workplace Act. Finding number 5 is a little creepy. You study disability, harassment, and intimidation. The definition is the same as that's used in gender in the Civil Rights Act, except the word disability is cut and paste, where it says gender in the Civil Rights Act. We know disability, we know harassment, whether it's on gender or disability, is a very insidious process. It's really kind of involves conspiracies of sorts. And we're frequently asked because the people are really jacked up and interested in harassment. Remember, it's about 10% of all complaints. We were asked, what 3 impairment groups do you suppose, and I'm asking the audience this, there is the most actual disability and harassment? In other words, which impairment groups are harassed and intimidated with the greatest frequency and so blatantly that they much more frequently win when they petition the EEOC for investigation? And the answer is these 3 impairments: intellectual disability, brain injury, and deafness, one of our 2 sensory conditions. And then you ask yourself, you chew on it a little more, what do these conditions have in common? Well, they are pretty strong barriers often to communication. So if it isn't insidious enough already, the fact that these three groups bubble up as having the most harassment and intimidation and high merit findings, they frequently, much more frequently, prove and verify and validate their claim. If you can't completely understand what's going on around you or what people are saying or what you think they're saying, or you don't have the same vocabulary or communication skills, and whether it's in terms of input or output, you're at a disadvantage. In other words, the most harassment intimidation persists among those people who are most likely to be aware of or are at least very confused about what is really even happening. And I think it makes harassment all the more an insidious phenomenon. I'm not going to burden you with this, except to kind of set up the next slide and make it real small. On the left, you have all the right to work states in the United States. On the right side, in the middle, it's the green column, you have all the union security states in the United States. There are 25 states in each group. However, all the territories are actually union security territories. There are no right to work territories. If you take the 1 million people in the workforce at the midpoint of the data collection, which was around 2004-05, and you adjust for the number of allegations filed in your state, this is what you find. What would you think? Would there be more discrimination in a hire at will or right to work state? Or would there be more discrimination filed in a union security state? Well, the differences are dramatic. Let's look down at the bottom. Let's look down at the top right-hand corner. The gray states are union security. For every 100 allegations filed, you look down at the bottom, there are 160 allegations filed in a right to work state. In other words, 60% more filings of workplace discrimination under ADA Title I in the right to work states on a proportional basis, proportionate to the number of workers they have in their workforce at the midpoint of the data period, which is 23.5 years, about 2004. Also, you have a merit rate, look on the bottom, of for every 100 people that prevail in their case in a right to work state, you look up at the top right-hand corner on merit rate, there are 109 people who prevail in their case and win their case. The charging party wins 9% higher in the union security state. Now, there's a whole lot more. This isn't even published. I rarely present on this slide. I'm going to retire soon, so I don't think I'll lose my job for it. I'm kind of worried that I'm looking for some money from the unions for this funding and to flush it out a little more, but I'm a little afraid that I might end up next to Jimmy Hoffa or something. I just celebrated my 70th birthday, and I'd like to string out my retirement as long as possible. But this is an alarming, striking finding. It's going to be very hard to get this published. It's going to be very hard to get this published. But so I'm going to put much more detail into it and have a much bigger data set before I do. Now, we want to turn to Helen Keller, but first, Walt has been asked to kind of monitor the chat room and come up with a couple, 3 nice questions that people might have at this point of things we've covered, and we're ready for that. We probably don't want to go more than 10 or 15 minutes. We'll probably have we're going to go straight through to the end through Helen Keller, and we're probably going to have, 25 minutes, I hope, or more for even more discussion. So if we have to cut this short, um, it will not be our last discussion period. Walt, what you got for us?
The first question is from Professor Ralph Crystal.
Uh-oh.
And Professor Crystal asks, can you discuss the Ability One program and the EEOC class actions lawsuits?
Okay.
And this is to Dr. Rumrell or Dr. McMahon.
So I'll answer that. And Ralph, the answer is no. Okay. We have limitations on our data set. We only deal with EEOC allegations and their closures. If a case is closed and the parties aren't satisfied, and the charging party wants to sue and it goes to court, we drop that file. In other words, it's going to be disposed of in court. It's headed for litigation. So we're only looking at, one of the reasons is we don't want to muddle with different courts, state courts, federal courts, in civil actions and expert witnesses. I will tell you this, less than 3% of all EEOC filings end up moving forward to litigation all the way to the end of a trial. Those that do move to litigation are usually settled in the court, oftentimes on prima facie evidence of one's guilt or innocence.
So Brian, these allegations that we're examining here, they're most often resolved either through or as a result of the EEOC's investigatory process.
Correct, and that's where we want a nationally consistent process for how the outcome is arrived at. If a case has merit or the case has no merit, and only the EEOC can give us that. Because a lot of the law cases are tried in state courts, and state courts have 47 different variations of the AD law. So keep in mind, 3% get to a trial verdict, and 95% of those cases that go to trial are won by the employer. That's as much as I can say about it now, but I don't, because I don't study those things. They're studied in North Carolina. By the way, I could give you a person who just studies the litigation. There are very, very few there are very few class action suits in anything. It's almost impossible to get a class approved as a class, I mean, because of the way laws are. But I don't know. We don't, because we don't study that. Thank you. Who else you got, Will?
This next question is from Caroline Gooden. Can you tell us a bit about the Sutton trilogy?
Sure. The Sutton trilogy was 3 Supreme Court decisions in the late 90s that just ripped the heart out of the ADA. The biggest one was the case of Sutton. This was an airline pilot who was legally deaf. Two twins, actually, twin sisters that were legally deaf, but with amplification, they went to flight school and qualified for flight school, but they were not allowed to be employed because of their vision status. At the root of the cause was the notion of mitigating circumstances. So the Supreme Court inserted that when we decide whether or not you're severely disabled, we have to strip you until you're naked. In other words, if your pain can be mitigated with eyeglasses, you're not disabled. If your pain can be mitigated with medications, you're not disabled. And so you could imagine the number of people protected. I mean, you just look at the pharmaceuticals alone, not to mention surgeries, that and assistive and adaptive technologies that people use that keep them employed, but they're not disabled because they're not in pain, at this moment. So it was very hard to prove that you met the definition of disability. What
And Brian, the other two decisions really continued to just restrict the definition of disability and further amplified this mitigating measures standard. And the upshot really isn't it that fewer people were now covered as people with disabilities, considerably fewer, right?
correct. But now that was now, but the amount, so business's position was certainly these things aren't what Congress intended. Well, Congress showed what they intended in the amendments, because nothing was so bipartisan. It said, don't tell us what we meant to say in the original Civil Rights Act. So just about everything that was weakened, just about, I mean, really, they might have won, literally 10% of the battles rather. Just about everything came down, not just to restore the original intent of the ADA. You are presumed to be in your naked state when you're considered, but don't you have assistive devices and hearing aids and canes and dogs and stuff? Take that stuff away. That's the judgment that's made today on whether or not you would be disabled. So it's all been reversed.
And Caroline, the really important point here, it's a great question, is that the Sutton trilogy, sort of in the middle of the history of the ADA, and then the subsequent ADA Amendments Act, which really restored the promise of the original law, it created these three phases of ADA implementation. Wouldn't you say, Brian, where you've got the original ADA, where the definition of disability was what it was intended. The Sutton trilogy then and really narrows and restricts the definition of disability, so many fewer people are covered. And then in 2008, effective in 2009, the ADA Amendments Act restores those protections and in fact really redoubles them and makes it easier than it ever was for people to document their disability status. And what we see in analyzing these on kind of a trend line is that as the definition becomes more inclusive, the number of allegations goes up on a straight line. So there was a severe decrement in allegations during this Sutton era that we call it. And because allegations are going down because people weren't bothering because they weren't considered disabled. And then ADA Amendments Act, we had more allegations and coming back that way. And since the ADA Amendments Act, right, Brian, the numbers have continued to increase. So more discrimination, on one hand, you might say more discrimination is happening, and that may be, but more discrimination is being identified and redressed. And we see that as a positive thing.
Walt, I think we're going to have to get back to our content.
Okay.
Yep.
Because after all, this is why people came. Hearing loss versus vision loss.
That's probably the next question in the chat, Brian. What about the study?
Oh, yeah, when are you going to get to Helen? Okay. So let's lay it out here. There's about 22,000 hearing loss allegations in the entire 23.5-year period. That's the definition that the EEOC has of deafness. I don't want to argue it. I understand that there are many deafness advocacy groups that might disagree with that, but that's the definition that they use. I will tell you, I'll just move right on to the EEOC definition for visual loss. You can read those things for yourself. Blindness of one eye, low vision, not better than 20/200. A condition of varying degrees of visual loss. I'll tell you the biggest limitation in this study, and it's not the only study, is there are certain impairment groups where they're harvesting the data on visual loss and hearing loss, but we have no information about the 21,000 hearing loss or the 16,000 visual loss with respect to the severity of their impairment. You have people with very mild losses, and you have people with very severe losses, basically no function in terms of these senses, and you have everything in between, and there's no way we can get to that data because there's 45 impairment groups. We have the same problem with many other things like back conditions and musculoskeletal, and brain injury has 3 levels of severity that we'd love to have severity data. We just don't have it. I'm sorry. So specific numbers and severity indicators are not provided, but let's move ahead. We also benchmark these things to a general population. So we've got another column you'll see in our tables, which is really large, not 16,000 and 20 something thousand, but 660,000 allegations. Remember, allegations are not people; they're charges. But occasionally we want to compare vision versus hearing loss. That's the mission. But from time to time, we're going to bump up one or the other or both of them combined against general GenPop. GenPop is all known disabilities that are not sensory. So everything else where we know what the impairment is, and subtract out the vision and hearing loss, that's 661,288. Makes for a great comparison group to see what the benchmark is. So you'll also see how do blind and deaf or blind and deaf together compare to every other disability. So who's in general disability? Large numbers of physically disabled people, large numbers of behavioral impairments, meaning mental illnesses and addictions, and large numbers of neurological conditions, okay? So that's the three broad categories of disability. When we do these studies on broad categories of disability, we have physical, neurological, behavioral, sensory. The only thing in sensory is blindness and deafness, and then other things where we don't know what the impairment is. What do we see on, what are we going to look at? We're going to look at the things we've told you about. What are the demographic characteristics of the charging party, gender, age, and race? What are the issues? What's going on in the issues? And who wins and loses these cases? Remember, these are population statistics. We use descriptive and very simple non-parametric statistics. We don't have to use more. The non-parametrics allow for not having to know that the underlying assumptions of one of the data sets or the other, one of the comparison groups or the other is not normal. No, it doesn't matter because these are not samples at all. What you're looking at is every single instance of reported discrimination. Now, certainly all reported discrimination, 823,000 cases, is a sample of all discrimination. But when you're studying crimes, whether they're civil crimes like discrimination or violent crimes and criminal crimes like murder, you can only study what's reported. There's absolutely no question there's more than 0.8 complaints that people have. But try to keep in mind, of the 800,000 population that we look at, the victory rate, if you will, is still around 25%. And that is an unbelievably stable figure. So we use, you have some other information there about methods and statistics, and those of you who are interested in that, which I would bet is, a small percentage of people attending today, because you like to get to the findings, and you can argue with us about methods at any point by contacting us. But this is what we're going to take a look at. So the first thing we look at is the demographics. And you see, I'll move my little wand around, that, remember, we're always comparing 21,000 hearing files with 16,000 vision files. And we're looking at a test of proportion using chi-square. And we're looking at proportions, percentages. What percentage of their own internal group has this characteristic? So you see that proportionally speaking, we know one group's bigger than the other in frequency. That is no longer important. What's important is what's in these columns with red ink. There are far more blind people who are males than in the deafness group. There are somewhat more females in the deafness group. Conversely, than in the blindness group. Both of these are significant differences. The relative values are high. But if you look at the general population for male, you'll see that that these are very high representations, 50 and 53% compared to 45% in the general population that are male. So in both groups, vision and hearing, there's a really inordinate number of males and a really inordinately lower number of females. The age is a bump. The general population, everything is always around 45, 47 years in terms of median, but it never has much bearing on things. But you get people from 15 years old all the way to 85 or even 90 years old sometimes. But obviously in the work years and in the high earning years, you're going to find a median. Race is always interesting. The hearing group is much more Caucasian than the vision group. And the vision group is identical to the general population. But the hearing group is far more Caucasian than what you find in either the vision group or the general population. African Americans, look at the general population first, 22%, just a tick higher than the vision group, but lower, far lower representation of African American groups in the deafness group, probably the lowest of any of the impairment groups we have. No significant difference for Hispanic, Mexican, Latinx, but both groups in sensory are higher than, and that's a nice jump. That's that would be significant if we ran that statistic, are higher than the general population. So people with sensory impairments are filing more than people with other disabilities, and substantially so. No differences in the other group. In Asians, though, general population would be 1.3, very close to blindness, 1.4, slightly higher of Asians. And this is a very, very proud statistic that I see. In deafness, you have 1.8. So you're almost, like 30, 40% higher than general population, and even much higher than deafness. Overrepresentation in Asian, underrepresentation in African American, those are very strong. Overrepresentation in Caucasian for the deafness group.